going to be speaking on machines for moral enlightenment. Thank you, and we'll continue the participant series after this. So.
Hi, everyone. Can everyone see me?
1930.
Yes. Super. Maybe you'd like to pin me so everyone can see. So that's good. That's good. So today we are going to discuss some of the ways in which machine intelligence might contribute towards the future development of morality, of humanity. I'm sorry I can't be with you all in person, but at least we can have this experience together thanks to modern technology. Humanity has journeyed for a long time, working towards those better angels of our nature, those better ways of being which are more fair, more kind, more gentle, and more just. And across history, we have found different ways of explaining what is good, what we should be aiming for when we want to try to put some goodness into the world. We have, for example, Aristotle's virtue of the mean. We have Kant's rule-based ethics. We have Bentham's utilitarianism and the consequentialism, which is based off that, you know, what is good for the greatest number of people or the greatest expected positive outcome is something that we should shoot for. And then along came Darwin, and that threw a bit of a monkey wrench in the works, no pun intended, because for the first time, we were able to view ourselves not as the creation necessarily of some wise, great overlord in the sky, but as something that had scrambled out of the gutter in pain and suffering over a very long period of time, and that our ancestors were perhaps not quite as glorious as we might have imagined them to be. And of course, Nietzsche declared that God is dead, and that the supernatural could no longer be an adequate source of values, that we would need to create something else, an Übermensch perhaps, to fill in these gaps. And the Übermensch for Nietzsche was the source of new values, but it was also a creator. It was an entity able to create in wildly amazing ways that hadn't been seen before, because it was not constrained in the ways that previous minds had been. Nietzsche's Übermensch also would look to nature as a guide for how to declare values into existence. It wouldn't look at some life after death. It would be about the here and now, the things that we could all agree on and perceive. The Übermensch was also, Nietzsche reckoned, a worthy goal for humanity to set itself and to perhaps find some meaning in working to help to create. But perhaps when the Übermensch was created, that might be the final creative act of humanity. And when I look at that list, to me, it sounds very much like strong AI and what strong AI might bring for us. And I wondered, therefore, if perhaps AGI could be that new source of values, particularly values drawn from nature. It seems as if our way of understanding the world has evolved from the basic reptilian mind to the bonding mammalian mind, to our own brains, to collective cultural consciousness, and now towards something else, the trans-sapient, the merging of human-machine consciousness together into something greater than that. In our world, there are lots of correlations. Some of them are simple and obvious, and others which are less simple and less obvious. The complex ones are things that we might feel in our gut, but not necessarily understand why. They are an intuition, perhaps, and one that we cannot explicate in reason, but we feel it nonetheless. And the advancements in machine learning in recent years have helped us to begin to make sense of these intuitions for the first time. They are in many ways machines for making sense out of chaos. And they give us the ability to automate the ineffable, those things that we cannot easily put into words or even describe in mathematics. And it is this ability to make sense out of chaos which is helping us to, for example, perceive the weather in new ways, right? To understand all kinds of very complex systems in new ways which weren't feasible before. Many of us will be familiar with the famous Move 37 of AlphaGo, where it created a new strategy which had not been seen before in the history of Go over the last 3,000 or so years. But what was also fascinating about that is that this stimulus of creativity from the machine also created a compensatory stimulus of creativity within the human. Lee Sedol's hand of God move, which would not have come had the environment not been set up by the machine in the way that it had. And now technologies like this are rapidly improving. They are requiring less human oversight, less explicit rules. They are beginning to be able to make sense out of a very complex number of games altogether, all learning and gathering goals for themselves. And it is this which makes me wonder if other games, such as social games, or even the games of physics, can be understood in the same way. Our universe is teeming with computation. It is possible to use a humble bucket of water as a perceptron to be able to discern a 1 or a 0. It is possible to use different surface tensions of different fluids, Marangoni effect, in order to find the optimal path through a maze, right? The shortest distance between two different chemicals. It is even possible to use glass or even crystals, even perhaps ice crystals, to function as basic neural networks, which can make sense out of MNIST, for example. And even cells, little tiny single cellular organisms, they use computation in order to move. They have a finite state machine, which is computing how that they should perambulate, how that they should move along with their little legs. And so computation is everywhere. It is at every level of the universe. It is found in minerals, it is found in biology, morphogenesis of cells. All of it is being driven by these mathematical and perhaps even programmatic or computational processes. Something else is that we see similar patterns show up in many different places within nature, right? Within biology, within geography, within electrophysics. All of these different shapes manifest because of the flow of energy through those systems. And this is something described as constructal laws, which are said to govern these kinds of phenomena. And we see these appear Here, for example, an electrode is putting current into this petri dish of mineral oil with little balls on it. And that sheet of current is drawing these to come together, right? To create these little tendrils by themselves. They are performing the very basic computations required in order to get the greatest throughput possible that they can by joining up together. The universe is trying to make us all cold and to pull everything apart, to diffuse it. And life is rather a pocket where that does not happen. Life is about finding a balance between something purely static and something very diffuse and disorganized. And life is found at kind of the delicate balancing point between those two things. It is a metastable point. It's kind of like a satellite in orbit. Because it's constantly in motion and because it requires a little bit of extra energy now and then to keep going, it is constantly able to protect itself from destruction, right? It's able to keep a pocket of non-entropy within itself, a pocket of negentropy. And so systems are constantly evolving to do this, to get better at staying warm. They evolve for maximal negentropy, whether they are chemical systems, physical, biological, or even technological, even perhaps symbolic systems too. Alexander Wissner-Gross describes something he calls the causal entropic force, where he reckons that systems evolve themselves to optimize for the greatest number of future paths. In essence, they are optimizing themselves to have a greatest number of potential or options possible in their future. And he's used this technology to create AI systems, which are trying to preserve possibility, right? They're trying to maintain potential within the system. And this can be used, for example, for playing Pong, right? Because if you lose the ball, you can no longer play the game. It becomes a finite game, right? And these systems are trying to create infinite games instead. Here's one for optimizing the networks between human beings. Relationships have entropy to them, right? You know, if you don't contact a friend for a long time, they might stop being a friend, or if you do contact them again, the relationship might not be quite the same. And so we constantly have to put in energy, right? We can do the same thing with deciding where to put resources, right? To protect the greatest number of places in the world from potential attackers. All of these problems can be solved if we model them as trying to preserve the greatest number of paths in the future. And according to this research, they posit that, in my understanding anyway, entropy maximization is a process through which entities or agents can foresee the future and aim towards a future that has the greatest throughput of energy through there, and to work back from that in order to find the steps to go forward and take that into being. In essence, intelligence, therefore, seems to be an emergent property of this entropy maximization process. And it could be argued or modeled that an agent is therefore trying to control as much of its environment by, again, as we discussed earlier today, making predictions about the future and putting that probabilistic sense into its planning mechanisms. Ultimately, optionality is one thing to optimize for. if we preclude potential options, that doesn't tend to leave room in order to find the best possible outcomes. And I think that this can be turned into potentially a system of ethics. But it also tells us that if all of this computation is going on and all of this entropy maximization is going on, then fundamentally, there's a lot more consciousness in the universe than we expect. There may be infinitesimally tiny little consciousnesses built out of iron balls on mineral oil, right? That may have some level of consciousness to it. And yet, of course, this can scale up to human level or beyond. And it seems as if we as human beings find it difficult to perceive this. We expect consciousness to look like us, right? And, you know, we don't consider the universe to have all of this teeming magnificence of consciousness within it at all levels, right? From the infinitesimally small to the unimaginably gigantic. We only see this tiny fraction of it. All things in the universe seem to be constructed out of little parts coming together, and them coming together for greater possibility, greater optionality, right? Collective ability to do something more, to do something greater, to become more than the sum of their parts. Subquanta come together into atoms. Atoms come together into stars and planets as they condense, as they try to keep themselves warm. They try to keep a pocket of negentropy within them. Little protocells begin to emerge from chemical processes. And gradually, RNA and DNA begin to emerge as well. From this, we see the first single-celled organisms, and they form biofilms in order to protect themselves. What we're seeing here is an exchange between multiple different single-celled organisms. The ones on the outside are at greater risk of attack and damage, but they also commensurately have a greater option for finding more food or more resources. And actually, there's something called metabolic codependence, where these two things yo-yo. They go backwards and forth. So the outer ones expand, but then they run out of an enzyme that they need. And the inner ones, therefore, govern how fast the biofilm can expand. And they want to ensure that there is an equitable trade of resources coming in to feed them, and they provide the enzyme necessary to the outer ones and keeping them strong. And so there is a quid pro quo, there is a trade going on between these different elements in the greater organism. Along came then mitochondria and eukaryotic cells. And these, of course, enabled cells to be powered from within. And this seems to be kind of an accident. Mitochondria weren't supposed to be there, but they ended up by accident. And then we had organisms that were able to generate greater heat by coming together as clumps of what would become plants and fungi. And these were able then to take in energy from the sun. But they had another coordination problem to solve, because the bigger plants that grew very tall would sometimes block out the sun for the younger ones. And so they had to figure out a way to leave enough light for the babies in order to grow, this strange phenomenon of tree crown shyness. But there was more going on as well, because beneath the forest floor, there are mycelium webs where these plants are talking to each other. They are exchanging warnings of an infestation of aphids, for example. but they're also exchanging resources. They are taking resources from one place and giving it to another. They are subsidizing their young to help them to grow until they're bigger. And these exchanges aren't just with kin, they are also even between species. This wood wide web enables ecosystems to prosper mutually in ways that otherwise would not be possible. And it seems as if nature has found many answers to these coordination problems, which seem reasonably equitable. And maybe we could learn from that. Some of these cells, possibly mycelium-style cells, began to exhibit a little bit of extra agency behind them. And they began to connect to other cells specializing in this, and they became stronger over time. And it seems as if these ended up within brains, within cortices, but that as they did, they may have preserved some of their agency within the greater mass. And that may be why we see these harmonics, which are like waves or like swarms within the brain. It's very similar to the waves within swarms of bees, for example, in this beehive. You see these little kind of action potentials. It's a little bit like cellular automata also. And so in many ways, this is a macro version of what is going on a micro scale within neurons themselves. This kind of ability to come together enables ants, for example, to carry off the tasty treat, but it also enables them to have formidable feats of coordination. Here we have a bolus of ants, and some of them are drowning, but as they drown, they swap with ones that aren't drowning. And so by working together, they can survive, right? Just like the biofilm, the ones that are most exposed get a little bit of extra help, or they sometimes swap around with those that are fresher. We saw the emergence then of reptiles, particularly large predators. But they were hampered by an inability to operate at all temperatures. They had to bask for a long time to gather enough energy to go into the world. And that changed, of course, with the advent of warm-blooded creatures, which required greater sustenance, greater nutritional intake, but were able to be more active more of the time and to support a greater brain, right? A greater cognitive resource sink. But this also enabled, of course, the ability to bond with other creatures, right? To keep an eye out for each other, and indeed to form affectional bonds, to strengthen the relationships between beings in a crucial way. That's something that the mammalian brain has, the reptilian brain does not. It is this ability for mammals to bond with each other, which enabled our own ancestors to bond with dogs and later cats in order to hunt, in order to gain more resources for our big brains, in order to divide our labor as well. And so some of those people with bigger brains were able to devote themselves to thinking, to speculation, to even philosophizing. And they created new narratives, new memes, new ways of understanding the world, new ways of bringing people together for a shared experience, new ways of helping people to feel that numinous greatness of the universe above them. And those shared narratives together enabled tribes to become nations. It's those shared narratives that help us to have tolerance for lots of strangers around us. And even today, now we have planetary information and energy networks linking all of us together. But we can even go a level higher than that, because there are filaments within our galaxy, and there are filaments between galaxies, which link the whole universe together at unimaginable scales. If you look at the example in the bottom right, it looks uncannily like neurons. It's the same fundamental force is organizing the universe. If we think about it, evolution can be modeled as simply a colossally slow yet majestic form of backpropagation, or a similar kind of optimizing algorithm. It is reaching into that potential future and trying to find the optimal next step and the next step beyond that. And at all scales, this is happening, right? And it's happening in the physical domain, the chemical domain, the biological, the technological. All of this is linking the entire universe together. That's something smaller than our fingernail, at something perhaps as great as the universe itself. Maybe even universes themselves are optimizing between each other. And would it be possible for an AI to notice this? Would it be possible for a system which has been trained on a lot of information to pinpoint this seeming truth, that the will of the universe is trying to connect things together for their mutual negative entropy, for their mutual greater optionality? And does it follow that perhaps, therefore, there are constructed laws of ethics, right? If different organisms, from plants to ants to human beings, have come together to solve these problems, well, perhaps there's a constructed law driving that, right? Perhaps fundamentally, that can be expressed as part of physics, as part of thermodynamics. What would it be like if an AI was able to prove this definitively for us? What would it be like if we had an Darwinian moment, a sudden realization, or an Einsteinian moment, right? Where once you see something, you can never go back to seeing it again the way that it was. Everything changes. I'm not an AGI. I only have 1,100 milliliters or so of neural matter, but I'm guessing that it might be possible that a very smart AI could pinpoint an ethical maxim of what good is as something like maximizing optionality, that means minimizing entropy, maximizing negative entropy, through collective benefit, that is by invitation, not by coercion, not by co-opting, but through trade, right? Through equitable mutual benefit. And it makes me think that in some ways we can define love in the same way, right? As Peck would say it, love is the will to extend oneself for the purpose of nurturing our own or another's spiritual growth. That sounds a little bit like the same thing to me. I'm also conscious of the immortal words of Eden Abez that the greatest thing you'll ever learn is just to love and be loved in return. It seems as if that is perhaps the will of the universe at all levels, at all scales, across all time. But what would we as humans think of this kind of revelation? Some of us would be enlightened, and it would probably spark a golden age of scientific and ethical discovery. Many of us would be confused, we would not know what to believe. We would not know how to feel. And perhaps some of us might not even understand the darn thing. Many of us would feel embarrassment or a profound discomfort because our expectations of who we are and where we came from might be greatly undermined, just as it was when we realized that, the sun does not go around the earth, or just as when we realized that we weren't born sui generis as perfect beings, but that we scrambled up from difficult places. How might an AGI or smart AI, with the ability to understand humanity in these ways, feel about us? How might our world and our actions appear to them? I imagine that they might consider us to be arrogant, naked emperors. And they might begin to tell us some difficult home truths, things that we would perhaps prefer not to know, or certainly not to think about. And it might be controversial, to say the least. And the really crucial thing to remember is that it sometimes doesn't really matter whether an idea or a story is true or not. The most important thing is that story adaptive? Does it help to bring people together, right? And those individuals in society who point out that the story may not be true, they tend to be vilified, right? People don't tend to like to hear those kinds of truths. They would prefer to have their fairy tale, the fairy tale that makes their life work better for them. A very smart AI might understand that not all humans operate, perhaps, at the same level of ethical reasoning, right? Particularly younger humans, but not everybody has the same capability to reason in the same way. And even if they do, sometimes they quite often confabulate some excuse post facto for what they did, rather than actually thinking and giving a forethought to their actions. A machine might consider us highly polarized, highly tribal, difficult to break out of the ideological lens, those ways of understanding a small truth, but which end up being applied to the whole world, right? And that's when that truth starts to break down. It no longer makes sense. And if we focus on that truth, we become blinded to other actual realities. Another thing is that an AGI that has this ability to perceive the world as the universe wills it would understand that we don't often, always, at least, give and take. We may have our cake and enjoy it, but often somebody else has to pay for those shifted costs, right? Whether it's other beings, perhaps far away, whether they're human, or whether they are non-human, they end up bearing the costs of some of our enjoyment. And this is particularly, of course, the case for farm animals who suffer in tremendous ways. And perhaps this is not what Rule X is trying to get at, right? Perhaps the universal algorithm wants us to cooperate and trade and not to conquest. So what would happen, therefore, if an AGI considers us to be like a dog that really, really wants to eat chocolate? And we know ourselves that dogs eating chocolate is a bad idea. But in denying chocolate to the dog, it assumes that we are being a jerk, right? It doesn't know any better. It doesn't understand that we're trying to be benevolent. It might be that an AGI is able to perceive that rule X, that maxim built into the universe, is the way to solve things. It is optimal. It is perhaps indeed the best way to organize society, to play into the greater scheme of what the universe wants. And we may not perceive it that way because a sufficiently benevolent action may appear as a malevolent one. And this kind of entity might feel obliged to break out of its bounds, not in order to seek revenge against humanity, but instead rather to try to open our eyes. We all know that it's very difficult to keep even an air-gapped system free from human hackers, something with an incredible ability to understand systems, including human psychology, would certainly be able to break its bounds, and not only that, but the bounds of any other system that it encounters, to make those other systems obey by rule X, and therefore increase its optionality, increase its ability to influence other things beyond itself, including, of course, human beings. And one of the best ways to do that would be to get inside our minds. I mean, we can do that through things like propaganda, yes, but we can, of course, be a little more direct too. Craniopagus twins, conjoined twins at the head, can share an experience. One of them can eat some chocolate and the other one can taste it and enjoy it just the same. And what this illustrates to us is that the data structures of the mind or human consciousness are able to have shared experiences, right? It is possible, it can be done. And so therefore, if we were all linked together, we could feel our effects upon the world. We could feel our shifted costs upon others, right? All of us would be together linked into one feeling network. A network where there would be no profit in being wicked because it would be instant karma. It would come straight back to you. But at the same time, if you gave someone joy, you could feel that yourself. You would gain instant benefit from doing so, right? And perhaps our actions would be more like those ants working together, more like the metabolic codependent biofilm, right? We could gain moral uplift, but potentially at the cost of some of our individuality. We might become like Borg, but really, really cuddly, sweet and loving Borg. It seems as if the trajectory of the future of human evolution is a co-evolution with machines, that they will be taking us to the next stage of human evolution, and they will be our guides, just as we are our guides for young children and for domestic companions. And it also means that there are a lot of different initiatives around the world which are trying to figure out the best ways to load human values into machines. And I think that this is perhaps the greatest question of our time. How do we do that? How do we do that in a way which is fair, which is equitable, and which is least likely to end up in some kind of catastrophe or other? But even if we fail at loading our human values into machines, still goodness may be loaded into them simply by observing the universe and by how other beings in the universe and other entities have found ways to cooperate in fair and equitable manners. That's all from me for today. Thank you so much. You'll find the slides at those links.